ලෝකයෙන් භාගයයි කලක් පවතින අලුත් පෙනුමයි.
Tonight, avoiding a shortage, prices of 60 drugs revised. Health Minister offers explanation.
This is the time that we can't dream of having a shortage of any drugs.
Setting the record straight. Delta variant isn't causing more deaths, says the WHO.
We have seen some countries suggest that there is increased risk of hospitalization for people who are infected with the Delta variant. We haven't seen that translate to increased death.
Clarity. The Director General of Health Services spells out what services can operate during the curfew. Disgruntled. Black flags hoisted across the country by the Catholic community in protest of lack of action of Easter attacks. All that and much more coming up on First at 9. This Saturday, the 21st of August, 2021.
දසනකාන්තී චූර්ණය සහිත ලීවර් ආයුෂ් දන්තාලේපය දත්වල ඇති ප්‍රශ්න 10ක් වලකයි.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening and welcome to First at 9. I'm Dham Kekanai. Now that the National Medicines Regulatory Authority has gazetted a maximum retail price for 60 medicinal drugs used to treat diabetes, high blood pressure and other non-communicable diseases by 9%. The price revision, however, has left some people disgruntled, with criticism levelled against the move on social media. Given the timing of the price revision, we contacted Health Minister Kehlia Rabukwella, who insisted that the revision was nothing to do with profits, but to ensure the free flow of medicines in the local market.
The National Medicines Regulatory Authority has gazetted a maximum retail price for 60 medicinal drugs. Accordingly, prices of 60 drugs used to treat diabetes, high blood pressure and other non-communicable diseases have been upped by 9%, including insulin with a maximum price of 1,496 rupees and 35 cents. It was previously at 1,372 rupees and 80 cents. Meanwhile, certain medical devices too have been subjected to a price revision, including the more commonly used blood glucose monitoring system and its test strips. A blood glucose monitoring system has been revised to a maximum price of 3,433 rupees and 50 cents per unit, up from 2,750 rupees. The test strips are now sold at a maximum price of 62 rupees and 13 cents, up by 12 rupees and 13 cents. The decision for a price revision seems to have irked some members of the public, with utterances made against it on social media platforms. We at First at 9 questioned Minister of Health Kehlia Rabukwella whether the price revision would be an additional burden on the people who are already battered by a pandemic.
Maximum medicine prices listed out somewhere around in 2017-18, where the dollar was 176 cents 80. That is the basis on which they made the calculations to fix your retail price. So obviously from there onwards, now there is a devaluation to the extent of like up to 210. And if you really calculate all the taxes that are involved in it, it is much more. But we were able to talk to the importers of the pharmaceutical companies. In fact, we have taken a 9% increase. In fact, it's a price revision which was based purely on the exchange rate differences, and there is no additional profit that will be accumulated to any party or any pharmaceutical company. Rupee devalued has to be taken, because if it's a government, the government can perhaps absorb the loss if there is a loss. But private sector, they may do it once, but they cannot do it continuously because they cannot carry on with their business. So this is the time that we can't dream of having a shortage of any drugs.
අද සේවසකට වැඩි ජනතා විශ්වාසය නව සංයෝගයකින් රයිනෝ රෝෆිං සහ සීලිං ෂීට්.
බත අට එකට මුසුකොට හෙළදිව් අට මුසු.
Now then, the Director General of Health Services has issued revised guidelines explaining the list of services, or spelling out, I should say, the list of services permitted to operate during the quarantine curfew period. With the imposition of the curfew, members of the public are now prohibited from leaving their houses except for essential service providers and those keeping medical assistance.
As announced by the government, a comprehensive island-wide quarantine curfew came into effect at 10 last night, restricting free movement. Imposed in an attempt to curb the rampant spread of the dreaded Delta variant of the novel coronavirus, the quarantine curfew will be in place until 4 a.m. on Monday the 30th. With the curfew, members of the public are now prohibited from leaving their houses, barring those employed in essential services and those seeking medical assistance. For a clear picture on which services can operate during curfew hours, Director General of Health Services has issued a guideline classifying services allowed to operate during the lockdown. Accordingly, persons engaged in health sector-related services have been allowed to report for duty without any hindrance. No routine health clinics will be held within the curfew period, but as for registered clinic patients, medicine will be delivered. DG Health Services says that essential home visits for maternal and child health care services should be provided on demand. Pharmacies too will be permitted to operate during the quarantine curfew. Vaccination programs against COVID-19 will continue to be held without any interruption. In addition, the police personnel, the Grama Seva and other public sector officers are authorized to function during the next 9 days. As for local government bodies, they can be operated with the required number of staff members deemed by the relevant authority. Utility service providers including electricity, water, telecommunications, media, fuel stations, domestic gas stations, garages and road maintenance services are granted permission to operate during curfew hours. With regard to the agricultural sector, farming activities, livestock and fishing can continue, however without crossing district boundaries. Grocery shops and supermarkets are only allowed to undertake online deliveries. Bakeries are not allowed to open during curfew hours. However, bakery produce can be sold via mobile services. Under the guidelines, banks are allowed to open only for limited financial transactions and customers are encouraged for online transactions. In the event of a non-COVID death, the funeral should be conducted within 24 hours with only the immediate family members allowed to be present. During the quarantine curfew, only one person is allowed to leave the house at any given time. The guidelines advise people over the age of 65 not to leave the house except for health matters. Daily wage earners at construction sites are allowed to work during this period, however under strict health guidelines, including social distancing and basic hygiene measures. Though the country's COVID situation has come to a point where a lockdown is deemed necessary, certain shop owners kept their establishments open well past 10 p.m. Meanwhile, the police upped spot checks at the entry points to Colombo. In the meantime, Minister of Trade Dr. Bandula Gunawardena engaged in an inspection tour in Petha this morning. Wholesale shops in Petha were open for trade from morning until midday sans restrictions. What's more, the government has decided to provide a 2,000 rupee allowance for those whose livelihoods are affected by the current quarantine curfew. Accordingly, the Ministry of Finance has directed district secretaries to prepare a list of names of the beneficiaries with the allowance intended to be disbursed from next week.
Now then, since the Delta variant was identified in the country, it has been the general belief that it causes the increase in daily COVID deaths and cases. However, the World Health Organization says that this is not, however, the case in relation to fatalities. The global authority says that the number of deaths owing to the Delta variant is similar to other variants of the virus seen so far. Meanwhile, the country confirmed its highest number of daily COVID fatalities during the last cycle with 198, while 3,884 new COVID cases have already been confirmed in the island so far during the day.
Sri Lanka's daily COVID deaths have risen sharply in the recent weeks from what it was before. The daily figure is now in triple digits and is closing in on 200 deaths a day, with the epidemiology unit confirming 195 COVID-related deaths yesterday. The 3,839 new infections recorded in the country yesterday was also the highest ever confirmed so far. The record levels of daily infections and deaths thus far have been attributed to the Delta variant of COVID-19, which wreaked havoc in India similarly, if not worse. Though the public perception of the Delta variant is that it causes more deaths, the World Health Organization disagrees.
We know that people who are infected with the Delta variant have higher viral load. They have more virus in them, which is a really important finding because they can transmit more easily if you have more virus. The way the virus spreads hasn't changed, but if you have more virus, then it's easier to pass between people. In terms of severity, we have seen some countries suggest that there is increased risk of hospitalization for people who are infected with the Delta variant. But we haven't seen that translate to increased death. So increased mortality, meaning the number of people infected with Delta have not died more often than with the other strains.
Though the WHO's observations may sound surprising given the thousands of COVID deaths the island suffered and continue to suffer with the onset of the Delta variant, the numbers do back them up. During the first wave of COVID-19 last year, 13 deaths were confirmed in Sri Lanka from a total of 523 infections. The fatalities, 2.48% of the total number of cases, was recorded during the wave. During the second wave that followed in the same year, 596 deaths took place among a total of 89,626 cases confirmed during that wave. The deaths, however, is just 0.6% from the cases. Then, in the third wave, which swept across the country after April, a staggering 275,990 cases were confirmed as of last evening. The 6,376 COVID deaths during the third wave so far translates to 2.3% from the total deaths during this period. Nevertheless, the number, be it infections or deaths, are currently rising, and the WHO cites 4 reasons as to why this happens.
There's a combination of factors of why we're seeing increasing cases around the world. There's 4 major factors. The first are these variants of concern. So there are 4 variants of concern that WHO is tracking. The latest one is the Delta variant. It does have increased transmissibility. So if you have increased transmissibility, you will have more cases. But this is happening in the context of uneven vaccine distribution and vaccine use, which means a large proportion of the world remains susceptible to infection. If you have both of those factors, also in the context of increased social mobility where people are coming into contact with one another more, and you're not using appropriate public health and social measures, these 4 factors are an incredibly dangerous situation. And we're seeing this play out in all regions of the world, including in the Americas.
As for the question, what causes a virus to change, the answer is very simple. As long as the virus is left to spread in the community unimpeded, variants will continue to pop up. But that's not all.
There are a couple of different ways where the virus could perhaps change that we're looking at. One is when you have a lot of transmission. If you have a lot of transmission in an area and the virus is passing between people, there's more possibility for variants to emerge. The second area that we're looking at is if the virus enters animal populations. If you remember last year, we had this cluster 5 variant related to mink populations, and mink are very susceptible to SARS-CoV-2, and it can spread very easily between mink. And we always look when it passes between humans and animals to humans, you could have an increased risk of these mutations or these variants emerging. We also look at long, infection in people. And if they are infectious for long periods of time, immunocompromised individuals, for example, you could have variants. So we really need to drive transmission down.
The WHO also envisages a future that the world is rid of COVID-19, but stresses the need to move away from the cycle of lockdown to complete freedom in order to achieve it. It was similar thinking that the government adopted in its reluctance to impose a complete lockdown yet again.
What will COVID-19 look like in the next 3, 6, 9 months? What are the possible scenarios that we can look through? And it's very possible, because we have the tools right now, that we could drive transmission down so low. And in fact, we can minimize the severity. We could minimize the deaths because we have these tools. We have enough vaccines to be able to do that. And those who are most at risk around the world, we just haven't used them properly. It can become endemic, but that doesn't mean that the virus is everywhere all the time at this level. It means it is in specific locations, specific geographic areas. I hope that we can drive transmission down as quickly as possible, but we cannot do that with sort of this start and stop approach. We don't want to move from lockdown to lockdown to lockdown. I think what we need is to really tailor the approach to where it's needed. It isn't about when is the next lockdown versus when is everything lifted. We have to move out of that cycle. I am concerned about, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, there's a lot of non-essential travel that's happening right now, and that's going to have an impact. We're already seeing increases in transmission. All of these actions matter.
In the meantime, the country's inoculation drive is continuing unhindered, despite the imposition of an island-wide quarantine curfew. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa had instructed health officials to give priority to people above 60 years of age during vaccinations throughout the curfew period. The move is intended to address the concerns among elderly population about long queues and the potential dangers of virus contraction at vaccination centres. Therefore, health authorities urge over 60s who are yet to obtain the vaccine to do so without delay by contacting the hotline 1906. Yesterday alone, the number of vaccinations done in the island is 221,546. The first dose of the Sinopharm vaccine was administered to 13,356 people, while 72,985 of its second dose was also rolled out. 6,203 people were also recipients of the first dose of the Covishield vaccine, and 311 people received its second dose. Meanwhile, the Pfizer vaccine's first dose was rolled out to 59,256 people, while 57 people were given its second dose. The Moderna vaccine was also rolled out yesterday as 69,210 people were given the second dose, with 120 people being given the first. As of last evening, 12,073,373 people had been partially immunized, with 5,514,315 persons being fully immunized against the virus. Medical oxygen supplies, which had been an area of concern in recent days, was also boosted yesterday. 40 metric tons of liquid medical oxygen donated by India reached Colombo. This is to be followed by 5 containers carrying 100 metric tons of the same tomorrow, which was purchased by the Sri Lankan government. In the meantime, Minister of Health Kelia Ramukwella and WHO representative to Sri Lanka, Dr. Alaka Singh, met yesterday. During the meeting, Dr. Singh reaffirmed the WHO's support to Sri Lanka in the procurement of COVID vaccines, medical equipment and supplemental oxygen. On behalf of the WHO, she commended the Sri Lankan government for its efforts to ramp up the national inoculation drive. Further, Dr. Singh offered to facilitate the procurement of more rapid antigen test kits for the island.
We will see you shortly. Bear with us.
Big 3.
Welcome back. You're watching First at 9. Now, Chief Scientist of the World Health Organization, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, says that there isn't much difference between the body's immune response between vaccine-induced immunity and the infection-induced immunity. But she calls on people who have already contracted the virus to get the vaccine without fail, as it would boost the memory of the immune system. Dr. Swaminathan added that the immunity gained from an infection also depends on the severity of the infection.
After getting COVID, people do get an immune response, but this varies from person to person, and it depends on whether you had a mild infection or whether you had more severe infection. And we know from many studies now that if you've had a very mild or asymptomatic infection, then many people may have very low levels of antibodies that they form. So this is why we still recommend that even if you've had COVID infection, that you should go ahead and take the vaccination when it's available to you, because the vaccine then serves as a boost to the immune system. So the immune system's already seen the infection once, it's seen the virus when you had the natural infection, and then when you receive the vaccine, it sees the antigens again, it's reminded of the antigens, the memory gets boosted, and the immune response generally gets stronger and broader and is likely to be more long-lasting.
Meanwhile, since the vaccine rollout began, a topmost concern has been how long should a virus-infected person wait before getting vaccinated, especially with some countries opting for a gap well over 2 months. On this front, Sri Lanka's health officials have laid out a 2-week post-infection period.
Well, you can take the vaccine actually once you've recovered from COVID. So waiting for a few weeks is recommended. You should have no symptoms at all and you should feel perfectly well when you take your vaccination. However, there are differences between countries. Some countries recommend that people wait for 3 months or 6 months till after the infection. And this is because you have natural antibodies, which will keep you protected for at least that long. And because there are shortages of vaccine supplies in many countries, they are requesting people who've had the infection to wait for 3 or 6 months. But from a scientific and a biological point of view, you can take the vaccine as soon as you're fully recovered.
Dr. Swaminathan also explained the benefits of vaccination even after COVID infections.
The type of immunity that's developed after natural infection varies from person to person and is very difficult to predict. Vaccines have been standardized in terms of the dose of the antigen that's being administered, and this was based on many clinical trials that have been done. And so when someone receives a vaccine, we can be fairly confident and predict the kind of immune response they will get, of course, in the majority of people. So that's the main difference between natural infection-induced immunity and vaccine-induced immunity. There are very interesting studies going on now to look at the immune response when somebody has a dose of a vaccine after having had natural infection, and also when two different vaccine types are given one after the other. So the so-called mix and match approach. And scientists believe that perhaps this type of a hybrid approach might actually give us a much stronger immune response than just natural infection alone or giving a vaccination with the same vaccine alone.
Now, the Consular Affairs Division of the Foreign Ministry had limited its services to those in urgent need during the curfew-imposed period. The Consular Affairs Division located at the Silanko building in Colombo will remain closed for visitors during the lockdown period. Consular Affairs Services, or Consular Services I should say, will only be provided to relating to cases of deaths of Sri Lankans overseas and attestation of export documents and relevant certificates. They, however, will be dealt with strictly by appointment. Foreign Ministry says that the regional consular officers will provide services related to cases of deaths of Sri Lankans overseas. People seeking the relevant services are required to contact the Consular Affairs Division on telephone numbers 0112 335 942 and 0112 338 812. Alternatively, you can also email consular@mfa.gov.lk to make an appointment. The first Buddhist chaplain to the British Armed Forces, Professor Sunil Karyakarwana, says that there is a lot that can be adopted from Buddhism in times of crisis, but laments the lack of it by local leaders. His views came during a discussion with India Vriyamuatta on our current affairs program at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24.
Governance in adversity, policy measures and leadership affect in shaping and combating adverse issues faced by an economy.
In times of crisis, leadership really matters so much. If the leaders are kind of pointing fingers at each other, just imagine what it would mean for an average person. British Armed Forces talk about 6 key qualities in leadership: courage, discipline, integrity, loyalty, selfless commitment, respect for others. Discipline is the foremost. And I think this is where military really comes in as well. You know, sometimes we don't realize how much discipline, verbally, physically, mentally, we got to be in times of crisis.
The Buddha himself preached virtues for a ruler when it comes to running the country. We see that India, in the foreign policy, the 5 principles of Panchasila have been applied. We say this is a Buddhist country, but how much do we apply it?
In Sri Lanka, we have had amazing Buddhist leaders. There are a lot of amazing Buddhist qualities in our society. But sadly, our leadership doesn't seem to have embraced those for economics and other reasons.
Some may oppose the fact that Sri Lanka continues to label the country as a Buddhist nation. Do you see this as a problem?
Not really, no. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised. Our cardinal here is quite comfortable being...
His Eminence Malcolm Cardinal Ranjit.
Yes, accepting this as a Buddhist nation and how wonderful it is. Buddhism says, stay calm, do everything you can, and in the worst of circumstances, do your very best. So therefore, nobody can actually resist and argue with those basic Buddhist principles.
There has been continued pressure on Sri Lanka to become a secular state. With that kind of Western requests and also managing within the country people of different faith, how do we strike a balance here?
Secularity never becomes a problem for Buddhism, because Buddhism by very nature is interested in offering welfare, the spiritual support to others.
How does the UK Armed Forces deal with post-trauma depression and stress. Sri Lankan armed forces engaged in a 3-decade-old civil war. We ended the war, but the question of rehabilitation.
Post-traumatic stress disorder is a huge problem. It's not just in one military, across the world. And I think, what we don't realize is military is also part of our society. And then when we scar them, we damage them, we sometimes forget them. And I think Sri Lanka has that great ability to actually bounce back from any adversity, and that is resilience. So Sri Lanka has done it really well. We should be really proud of that. At the same time, we need to support these people.
We talk about pressure and the dangers and risks to the sovereignty of our nation, but what kind of role does the military play here in terms of the security and safety of the country, as well as policy? When we talk about Buddhist policies, virtues, how can we ensure the safety of the country?
Buddhism talks about the insurance that comes from within. If you are verbally, physically, mentally sound and disciplined, and then your security is already built in. The greatest security comes from those principles, values and standards. I think that's why military doesn't see like I'm going to go and wage a war, but they are basically interested in protecting the masses. If it is a terrorist who come with a gun to kill, you have to actually act. But that doesn't mean that you are actually acting with vengeance and to take revenge. This is the type of training that the military is given, which may not necessarily be understood by ordinary people.
Now, Afghanistan's ambassador to Sri Lanka, M. Ashraf Haidari, has called on Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa and Foreign Minister G.L. Pieris. In light of the recent events in Afghanistan, the Sri Lanka side had offered the ambassador and the Afghan embassy in Colombo their full support, consistent with the strong Afghanistan-Sri Lanka friendship and growing bilateral relations. Ambassador Haidari had briefed the PM on the situation in Afghanistan and had highlighted ongoing efforts by the country's former president, Hamid Karzai, and other Afghan leaders to broker the formation of an inclusive and broad-based government which would represent all Afghans and further build on their hard-won gains of the past 20 years. They had also discussed the implications of the recent developments for regional stability and international peace and security, highlighting the need for continued international engagement and support for sustainable peace in Afghanistan. Moreover, they had taken note of the expanding complex humanitarian crisis engulfing the country, hit hard by conflict, COVID-19 and climate simultaneously. In this regard, they had discussed the ongoing evacuation flights and the need to ensure safe freedom of movement and travel for all Afghans. Recalling Sri Lanka's decisiveness against extremism and terrorism, Ambassador Haidari had thanked Prime Minister Rajapaksa for his strong friendship with the people of his country. The Catholic community in Sri Lanka today hoisted black flags across the country, silently protesting over what they call the delayed justice to the victims of 2019 Easter Sunday terror attacks. The flags were hoisted after the Catholic Church appealed to the people to do so as the justice due to the Easter Sunday attack victims of 2019, though 2 years have passed since the crime. The flags were also hoisted in the main churches that were subjected to the attacks. Accordingly, church bells rang between 8:45 a.m. and 9:45 a.m. this morning in remembrance of the victims of the deadly attacks, while priests offered prayers. State Minister of Digital Technology and Enterprise Development, Namal Rajapaksa, today moved to reject rumours over government having increased taxes for e-commerce platforms by taxing online transactions. Issuing a statement, the State Minister says that the government is in fact reiterating its position that it will make way for e-commerce platforms and digitalisation to make their mark in Sri Lanka while assuring all assistance and facilities possible. The State Minister went on to say that the government will not be taxing online platforms, e-commerce platforms or digital businesses, adding that in fact relief will be offered in the next budget. The State Minister is also in discussion with Finance Minister Basil Rajapaksa to further relax taxes for e-businesses with a foreign currency inflow to the country. And that's it from all of us here at First at 9. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.